Tony Schaefer. Now, sadly, Great Britain has made the headlines this week for all the wrong reasons yet again. Right. And there you had Theresa May, who, although she was propelled to office by Brexit, is not really of the same sort of kinship, if you will, of a Donald Trump. And I don't know that there will be a remake of the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher sort of coalition that brought down the Soviet Union.
Charles, I don't think so. I heard her comments the day of the attack, and she said we must carry on. It's almost like they want to, as Joe was just saying, normalize the whole attack of radical Islam as like it's an everyday occurrence. Let's be clear on this. This is a policy failure. It's unmitigated allowance of invasion by migration. People have been studying this. We recognize when you have groups like this, you have a certain percentage who are going to be loyal or open to covering for and supporting ISIS and other radical Islamic elements. The Europeans have done this to themselves, and so her comments were not, in my judgment, in line with what the British people have called for. And the Brexit, and Charles, you and I spoke earlier today about NATO. Look, NATO has to do its job, and part of that job is adapting to the 21st century, to the 21st century threats. And one of those huge threats, as we see, is radical Islam and terror. We cannot depend upon police organizations to simply hope for the best and jump in there. That's why you need intelligence efforts, the massive amount of intelligence capability that NATO brings, and frankly, direct action using special operations forces when necessary to kill these folks.
Nile, what do you make, again, back in the UK, and will this latest attack change things, at least change the thinking? Because we know Brexit, in part, was driven by the immigration situation, particularly and the threat of radical Islam terror.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Brexit, Charles, because Brexit will make Britain safer. It will increase Britain's control of its own borders. And I think that Brexit will be very, very important to the fight against radical Islamic terrorists. And without a doubt, I think that this week's events have been absolutely horrific. They've shocked Great Britain. They've caused a great deal of anger. I think they will result, hopefully, in tougher measures being taken against Islamic extremism in the United Kingdom. After all, there are now several thousand individuals, jihadists basically, being monitored by the British intelligence services. At least 13 major terror plots have been foiled in the last few years. There are 500 active counter-terror investigations. The scale of the threat is absolutely massive. But for far too long, I think you've seen in place policies in the United Kingdom and many European countries that have been far too tolerant of the enemy within our midst. And we do need to see a crackdown against the brutal and evil Islamist extremists who are wreaking havoc at this time in Europe. Right,
and of course today, before President Trump spoke, Angela Merkel spoke, and behind her as a prop was a part of the Berlin Wall. And what I thought, guys, what was interesting is just hours before meeting with President Trump, Angela Merkel had held an event with President Obama. And at this event, President Obama used all of the highly charged buzzwords, including xenophobia, nationalism, intolerance, anti-democratic trends, and then went on to say that, quote, we can't hide behind a wall. What do you make of that, Joe?
See, I don't. That's why I'm not optimistic, Charles, that Europe gets it. And we know Obama doesn't give a damn, but Europe doesn't get it. This is right. This is an invasion by immigration, no borders. They've allowed these Muslims into these countries year after year. They have not forced these Muslims to assimilate. And now they're getting bitten in the butt, and they're not serious. There was more sadness at Manchester this week than anger. And, Charles, I think about what our Homeland Security Chief said today on Capitol Hill. He said there will be a lot more Manchesters in Europe and here unless we get serious.
Nile, do you agree with that?
Well, I think that, what you see in Europe today is potentially where the United States could be 10 or 20 years ago, because Europe has had decades of very, very lax immigration controls. And for far too long, they have, tolerated, I think, a very vicious kind of Islamist extremism within their midst. And I think that, the United States now should be looking closely at what's happening in Europe to learn the lessons of major failures across Europe for far too long. And the open borders policy that Angela Merkel and also Barack Obama support has been an absolute disaster for many parts of Europe. It's already causing huge problems for Germany. The United States must never go down that route.
Tony, President Obama also said that security should be defined more broadly than just military budgets. And essentially what he's saying is that the message is that President Trump should lay off of these NATO members and forget about the 2% obligation, by the way, the promise that they made, and think of other things, even like military pensions, as counting toward that. Is that ludicrous?
Charles, this is from the man who ran up our deficit more than any other man in history. I mean, President Obama is no spokesman of the reality in which we live. And no, look, as President Trump said, all the money that NATO could have raised within the process of those nations paying what they agreed to pay would put us a lot further ahead. And again, to my point, look, NATO has a role. It is not functioning in that role. And as you and Joe talked about, you know, the leaders, other NATO leaders, were very uncomfortable by the fact that they're being called out. President Obama is an enabler. He loves those folks for the fact they don't actually do anything. So he's all for continuing with the process. That's just not going to happen under President Trump and with American leadership. I think something's going to happen here.
All right, guys, let's leave it there. It wasn't just sophomore smirks and Obama that cast a shadow over this NATO summit. We've got a new